All right, well, hello everybody, and welcome to our Grow Native webinar about building your own backyard bird sanctuary with Mitch Leachman. The Grow Native program is a native plant marketing and education program that serves the lower Midwest, run by the Missouri Prairie Foundation. My name is Brooke Widmar. I'm the Director of Administrative Operations and Member Engagement for the Foundation. And I want to thank all of you for joining us for this. And I also want to recognize our Grow Native sponsors. They're listed here on the screen. Their support makes educational opportunities like this one possible. So make sure and check out our lineup of webinars and master classes. We have some scheduled through the end of April currently. And I see they're spreading far and wide. We have guests from Alaska all the way over to Massachusetts on this one. So again, this is Grow Native kind of targets the lower Midwest, but some of these basics and foundational stuff will be applicable to others in other states. So during the presentation today, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section there on your screen. And at the end, I'll come back on and read those out to Mitch. This webinar is being recorded. The link will be shared with all of you tomorrow, along with resources mentioned today during today's presentation. So to introduce today's speaker, Mitch Leachman very recently retired from the St. Louis Audubon Society, where he was the director of programs and the coordinator of the Bring Conservation Home program. He's been active with the Audubon Network for over 25 years and was on staff with the St. Louis Audubon the last 13. He's been gardening with native plants for 15 years and enjoys every one of the critters supported by his current inventory of over 80 species of plants. So without further ado, take it away, Mitch.
Awesome. Thanks, Brooke and Carol and the entire team at the Prairie Foundation and Grow Native. Really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak with all of you today, share my thoughts, share my experience with gardening for birds, building a sanctuary for wildlife and birds in particular in your own landscape. So this is treated as a beginner presentation, an introductory level. This is not intensely focused for advanced folks. So I hope that's not disappointing, but that's mostly just to say that we are going to cover all of the general principles that one would need in order to pursue this thought process, and yet also not get terribly specific about any of the actual implementation, right? So there will be examples, there will be things that you can actually act on, actions and take from this, but we're also going to include some resources at the end to help you learn more and again, do this in your own space. So the title slide here, you've got 3 different logos, and we do that, as Brooke mentioned, I am now volunteering with St. Louis Audubon, recently left employment. I wouldn't say I've retired, that might be implying a bit too much about me, but also you see the Bring Conservation Home logo here. That is a wholly owned program within St. Louis Audubon, and quite frankly, everything that the Audubon organization does regarding bird gardening, habitat gardening, native plants and such is because of that program. We're going to talk a little bit more about that program later as a resource. And then the Missouri Department of Conservation, they are an integral sponsor, you may have noted, of Grow Native. They're also a cooperative partner with St. Louis Audubon. They're also a resource. So again, we will touch on them later should you want to know more and pursue information about this. All right, so I have a few videos in this talk. Hopefully they will work. This, you may know, is a red-bellied woodpecker. This is a relatively common backyard bird across much of the United States, certainly popular and very abundant here in the lower Midwest, and a common feeder bird, right? This is a suet feeder, of course, an upside down suet feeder. So we go to the next slide and we see a number of other types of feeders. So when you think about the title of the talk, Building a Bird Sanctuary, so this might be what you're thinking. And this is with the supplemental feeders, platform feeders, tube feeders, and so on. This is a very common pastime. This is a very common approach that a lot of folks take that want to attract birds into their backyards, into their landscapes. And there's nothing fundamentally wrong with this. I do have some feeders, just suet at this point in our backyard. Oh, hummingbird. I forgot I put the hummingbird feeder in here too. Little props to the ruby-throated hummingbird. Sugar water feeder that a lot of folks do. It's worth pointing out that you're going to get some decent birds, but you're going to be limited in the numbers of birds and the variety of birds that you may see in your landscape just by doing the bird feeders. Here you've got a house finch, you've got the mourning dove, and then the northern cardinal. For those of you in the lower Midwest, either Missouri or Illinois, you may have a strong affinity for the cardinal, being, of course, a sports mascot for a lot of folks around St. Louis. And then, of course, it's a state bird of Illinois. So a couple dozen, a few dozen, that's not bad. That's pretty interesting. But the excitement here and what I want to draw your attention to, and certainly it's drawn my attention over the years, is the potential of birds in an average suburban landscape. The potential variety and diversity is 100, 120, 130 or more different bird species here in the lower Midwest, again, depending upon the particulars of the size of your space and what surrounds you and so on. But actively working to build a sanctuary, structurally working to provide the things that birds and other wildlife need, you go from a few dozen to 100, 120, 130 or more different bird species, like the cedar waxwing, like the blue-gray gnatcatcher here in the upper right, the American redstart here, a warbler, a wood warbler here in the lower center. So really, really cool birds, but not feeder birds, not birds that are going to be coming to a bird feeder, a supplemental contraption like that. So what we're talking about is habitat gardening. So that's another way to refer to or to think about this thought process in this approach. Building your own bird sanctuary is creating habitat, providing the conditions, recreating, if you will, recreating the physical environment that the birds and other wildlife would be utilizing in the wild, and recreating that in your own specific space, your workplace, your church, your home, of course, your neighborhood, right? It doesn't have to be just a home. But to do that, we're talking about creating and recreating 4 elements of that habitat. So this talk, this again, introduction, this broad survey of the topic today, we're going to touch on 4 elements of habitat, gardening. So food, water, shelter, and places to raise young. So those are the 4 key elements of habitat. We're going to spend a lot of our time talking about food, but we will touch on the other elements as well. And again, the key here is that all of these pieces need to be in place to make this work and to make that tremendous diversity and that tremendous support happen in a landscape. So what does habitat look like? Okay, so before we get into again more details, including specific detailed recommendations, what does it look like? There may be a stereotype. You may have a perspective in mind of what habitat gardening looks like, of what bird sanctuaries look like, what gardening for wildlife looks like. You may have a particular image in mind. I'm thinking, though, given what I've shared so far, that you'd look at this winterscape and go, yeah, there's probably not much, if anything, in those landscapes that's going to support birds or other wildlife. You'd be correct. A different landscape, also in winter. This actually happens to be a public common ground, a municipal space. And wow, I mean, nothing there, right? I mean, how would that help birds or the wildlife in the winter? In contrast, sticking with winter, then we'll have a couple of looks at warm season. And for many of us, it is warming up. Here, again, a small residential lot. You don't know necessarily what's in this space specifically, but there's stuff in it, right? There's things in it where you could imagine birds or other critters might find pieces of that habitat, right? Might find elements that they need, food and shelter, and so on, right? And yet, let me point out, and I'll emphasize this repeatedly, especially as we're looking at examples, this space, while covered in snow, does appear like, even though it's got a bunch of habitat-y stuff, it's still a human space, right? There's clearly what looks like a lawn, turf grass here in the middle of the front yard. So it's not exclusively, only, entirely for the birds or other wildlife. It's also for the humans that live here. It's kind of important. Different view, happens to be the same space, same landscape, I should say. This is the backyard. You know, we saw what looks like a gardened space, right? The front yard, but you go to the backyard, it's a little wild, right? A little more natural. And yet still we have a lawn. We're looking at pathways, right? So this is still a space that's utilized by humans. And oh, look, there's those feeders in addition to the habitat spaces. So shifting to the warm months, again, a few examples just to ensure that we're all on the same page and we know what we're thinking about, what a habitat garden, what a bird sanctuary might look like. Again, you know, I don't mean to criticize anyone who has this sort of a landscape, but I do mean to say very plainly that it ain't habitat. There's not much here of value to birds or other wildlife. One could be proud of this. One could have a sense of accomplishment, and you know, this may be your goal. But just to be very, very simple and very straight, that well, your goal just can't be birds and other wildlife, not with this particular approach. Again, in contrast, and you might recognize this space. I'm kind of hoping you do because of one of the photos you saw earlier with the winter scene. So this is that same front yard that we saw in winter. And there we go. Here we've got a lawn space in the front yard with an oak tree in the middle of it. We've got a tree lawn here, the little strip next to the street. We've got some plants in there too. But so again, this is a bird sanctuary. This is a wildlife sanctuary. This is habitat gardening. And at the same time, it's also for people, and there are humans that live here. Last example, then we'll get into some of the particulars of how to make all this happen. This is for those of you familiar with the St. Louis or perhaps many of our urban areas across the US, the older neighborhoods, the 100, 150-year-old homes, right? Those old neighborhoods, but still single family homes. You get those shotgun lots, those 30, 40, 50-foot wide lots that go back 100 feet or so. This is one of those lots in St. Louis City. And in our neighborhoods across St. Louis, we also have many of these lots with these strange steep slopes in the front. So in this particular homeowner, they're like, you know, I want to do birds, I want to do butterflies, I want to do wildlife, and I don't want to do that slope. I don't want to mow the slope. So they planted the slope. So this is a very cool city landscape. And they too still have humans at play. And here they've got some paver stones. They got a little bit of turf up on the top. So again, just examples of what we're talking about. So I've mentioned native plants once or twice already. That shouldn't be a shocker, given Grow Native being the underpinning program with the seminar series. So we need to use native plants in order to make this happen, in order to get all those birds that we were talking about, in order to support all of the other critters beyond the birds as well. So why do we need native plants? Well, in short, nearly all of the songbirds across North America require insects. They utilize and consume insects during their life cycle. The statistical, the scientific, the data point is 96% of land birds. I just don't use that very often. Instead, I talk about songbirds because we kind of inherently know what songbirds are, and land birds just sound a little bit kind of wonky. But here we've got tufted titmouse. We've got a summer tanager here in the upper left. We've got a prothonotary warbler, another warbler we mentioned earlier. And then again, those cardinals show up. So all of our songbirds, nearly all of our songbirds, require insect protein during their life cycle. It's all about reproduction. So reflecting back on those bird feeders earlier, again, I said they're not bad, but bird feeders do not support reproduction. Bird feeders feed adult birds because babies, right, young birds on the nest, young birds require protein, and there's just not a lot of protein that's going to come from those seeds in those bird feeders. So the adults, while the adults may be coming to that bird feeder during the breeding season, including when they have babies on the nest, to get fueled up themselves as adults, but then they're going to immediately go looking for insect protein to feed their babies. Again, just like humans, a baby animal requires protein to grow. And for songbirds, the single best source of protein is insects. It's just about biology. And all this emphasis on songbirds, think about other types of birds. Some of my favorites, think about hawks, eagles, and owls. Well, they also feed their young protein, but they do it with other animals, right? They do it with other birds in some cases. They do it with rodents. They do it with, ducks. They do it with, whatever they can get their talons in, but then they tear it up and they're equipped to eat larger prey. For songbirds, it's all about insects. Caterpillars, we talk about a lot. I'm going to use a number of examples of caterpillars. These, of course, are the larvae, the young stage of butterflies and moths. And these are not the only insects that the birds are eating, but they're a huge, huge part of their insect diet when they're feeding their babies. And it makes sense because there's such a huge variety of Lepidoptera, butterfly and moth caterpillars across North America. Again, you see, some 11,000 species. But also, I like to illustrate it this way. If you're a bird and you got to feed your babies, which would you rather find and collect? Soft, juicy, can't fly away or run away caterpillars, right? I mean, at their fastest, right? They're not going to escape, the watchful eye of a bird, versus say a flying beetle like a June bug, right? I mean, if I'm a bird, I now have to expend energy to catch that flying beetle, which might not even be active when I'm active, which is in fact typically the case. June bugs are flying at night. But not only do I have to expend energy to catch it, but then I've got to disassemble it because that hard shell is not likely going to be able to be swallowed and consumed by the baby bird. So again, these caterpillars get a lot of attention for those reasons. So what are we talking about? What's the scale? So a study that was done a number of years ago focused on chickadees, and it explored how many of these caterpillars, how many of these butterfly and moth larvae would it take to support a family of chickadees, right? So one nest full. And the poor graduate students that were tasked with this duty, right? This was their project. It's like, sit and watch and use your binoculars and take pictures and, make hash marks on a scratch pad. Today, I guess you'd have an app for clicking off the number of caterpillars that were brought. But it's insane. It's insane, and yet it makes sense, because if you have had the good fortune of seeing any active songbird nest, doesn't have to be a chickadee, could be wren, could be cardinal, could be blue jay, sort of any songbird nest, if you've had the good fortune of seeing one where the parents are feeding their babies, you didn't do the math, you didn't do the hash marks, you weren't one of those graduate students, and yet reading the data here and then thinking on what you had observed, the dawn to dusk feeding operation of those babies, you're looking at this kind of going, yeah, wow. Didn't do the math, but it makes sense. It's some crazy numbers, but it makes sense. That's a lot of food. That's a lot of insects. So we do have to get the plants, right? Because that's what we're supposed to be talking about. So the fact is that in order to support these insects, we need the native plants, because if I am an insect, like again, a caterpillar that eats a plant at my life stage of a larva, it turns out I am very likely a specialist. I have evolved to get past the chemical defenses in the tissues of a certain plant or a small group of plants, a small individual number of plants, because that's what plants do in order to defend themselves, right? So anything that is eaten, anything that is prey at some point, simple biology and ecology, anything that is prey has to escape, has to have defense mechanisms. If it didn't, then all the prey would disappear in sort of one cycle. There'd be no prey left for the predators in the future, right? So they can't reproduce. So some prey always has to escape. If I am a rabbit, I'm going to hop away, I'm going to run, I'm going to conceal myself. You know, those June bugs are active at a certain time of the day, right? Plants just don't have those options. So plants have these chemicals in their tissues that make them unpalatable to many critters that want to eat them, save for the small numbers that specialize and figure out how to defeat those particular chemicals in again, certain array of plants. So the photo here, some of you may know, is a monarch caterpillar on milkweed, munching away on milkweed. So that is a very, very good prototypical example of this specialization, right? So monarchs do not exist without milkweed. So our monarch butterfly caterpillars require the milkweed to feed on and then to get to their point of metamorphosis and becoming adults. Without milkweed, they don't reproduce. They can't have food to eat. So again, that's an example of the specialization. So as you may have already, connected all the dots here, unfortunately, our landscapes across this country are dominated by non-native plants, are dominated by plants that were imported from other countries as we suburbanized, as we went out from the cities, post-World War II. We still, of course, are building neighborhoods, building subdivisions, and we still, for the most part, plant them with imported plants. That's just what the nursery trade is stocked with. So to be fair to those plants are not bad, right? Those plants have a use in their home country. But in this country, for the most part, the imported non-native plants do not have insects that eat them, because we didn't bring the insects when we brought those plants over. So again, that's the connection, right? That's the science lesson for today. That's nearly the extent of the science lesson for today. But if we want to do the bird sanctuary, we need to support the insects. And if we're going to support the insects, we need the native plants. So here's one of a handful of slides that I have for you. I'm going to sit on this for a minute or two. This is primarily just to show you in a very dramatic way the critical importance of native plants versus non-native plants in a numerical presentation. So the numbers are how many different species of butterfly and moth caterpillars have been seen feeding on each type of plant. So common non-native plants on the right, common native plants on the left, and you quickly recognize that the critical value of those native plants, supporting those insects, again, supporting those plant-eating insects, supporting those Lepidoptera species that feed the birds, versus the non-native plants that are just not helpful. Again, you may like the daylilies, you may like the boxwoods, you may like the hostas, and you might choose to keep them in your landscape, but just recognize and understand that they are not supporting this food web. They are not supporting this thought process of, again, creating the habitat, creating the conditions that the birds and the other wildlife need. So a quick point, if you look at like a peony and go 3 species, well, that's not 0. Well, it actually probably is 0 because these numbers are a compilation of all of the observations that have been made across the country of these different types of plants. So in other words, an oak tree in my yard doesn't have 518 different species of butterfly and moths feeding on it. There's not even 518 butterfly and moth species in my yard, okay? But again, when you capture all of the genus, the Quercus genus across the country and all the observations and all the different ranges of all the different critters, then you come up with 518. So the same thing with the non-native plants. So in a given landscape, it's probably 0 for zinnias. It's probably 0 for peonies, unless you happen to be in that one space with that one particular critter that has figured out how to eat the peonies or the zinnias. So this drills in a little bit more deeply. This gets closer to some of what you're looking for today, specific things that you can do, specific things that you can act on. So these are all native plants, no non-natives on the list. This gets more in-depth, showing you woody plants on the left, herbaceous plants on the right. And again, the tremendous value that these plants have for feeding those butterfly and moth caterpillars, knowing that they can be then food up the food chain for the birds and other wildlife. And I like to highlight a couple things on a chart like this as you're looking at it. And again, speaking of looking at it, so all of these webinars through Grow Native and the Prairie Foundation are recorded. These will be on their YouTube channel. So if you don't get all of this written down, or you don't have your phone handy and you're not taking a photo or what have you, so you have a chance to look at this later after it's uploaded. But violets on the right side under herbaceous. So if you have been a neat and tidy lawn person, right, you like that look, or perhaps even in your garden beds, you like to have them all structured and organized, you may really have been frustrated by violets. And yet here, one, we've got native plants, because nearly all the violets you're going to see in your own landscape, unless you went to the nursery and bought an African violet or something, if they're volunteering in your landscape, they're almost certainly a native plant. And we've got 27 different species of butterfly and moth caterpillars feeding on violets. There's a whole group of butterflies called fritillaries that will lay their eggs on violets. So go figure, right? Who knew? So that I think is enough here, because it's just worth an exclamation point, right? Come back to that hummingbird. We saw the feeder earlier. Again, if you want to do a hummingbird feeder, that's fine. Just recognize that you're feeding the adult hummingbirds. If they've got babies on the nest, as soon as they get that high octane sugar water hit, they're going to go look for insects to feed their babies. And perhaps not needing to be said, but just the quick graphic of holes in leaves, right? The right side, native plants, the left side, non-native plants, neat and tidy on the left, holes in leaves on the right. And that's the food web. That's the ecology. That's the habitat in action. All right, food. That's not all of the food story. I told you most of what we're going to talk about today is food. So insects. So that's, again, the life cycle. That's reproduction, right? That's all about raising the babies. Well, that's fine, that's great, but birds exist in our landscapes in other seasons, okay? And unless you're a woodpecker or a thrush like a robin that is quite adept at finding insect larvae in things in the leaf blanket in woodlands, many birds, though, that we see in the cold months in the eastern US in particular, many birds, they're adaptable and they eat other things outside of that breeding season where they're feeding their babies. Fruit is one of them. Here you have an example of a really cool, in the lower Midwest, small native tree called a serviceberry. This is a downy serviceberry. This is a cedar waxwing. This happens to be fruit that is ripe in summer. The serviceberry fruit. Here, shift seasons, this is now the fall. This is a very cool, very attractive native shrub called beautyberry. And this is a gray catbird that stopped during fall migration to eat the beautyberry fruit. And this is a very reliable thing. This is something we like put on the calendar at our house here in St. Louis County. Every fall, I look forward to seeing the gray catbirds as they stop by on their migration. We typically do not see them during the breeding season. They do breed around our area, but not in our yard, not in our neighborhood. And so we just wait for fall, where the gray catbirds stop by as they're migrating south, and our beautyberry shrubs have ripe fruit, and they stop and they fuel up on the beautyberry fruit. So here's another one of those slides. Again, I'll make a few comments here as you look at it, as you maybe scribble some notes. So this is a collection of native plants that support fruit for the birds. So again, reference different seasons. So it's not surprising, perhaps, for me to say that if you're considering priorities of building this stuff in your landscape, I would suggest, when it comes to fruit-bearing plants, think in the future about summer fruit plants. Focus on the fall and the winter. And I say that because, again, as we've already established, there's plenty of other food during the summer. So as you're just getting started in this process, look at the critical seasons and go, okay, so let me see if I can get at least one plant of at least fall and winter with fruit in my landscape. And so you might, again, find different plants like that. So this is not all the native plants that provide fruit. This is just a good sort of starter list. Also, this covers an array of types of plants. The beautyberry shrub you see here in the middle, there's large trees on here like the hackberry, the black gum. There's small trees like the serviceberry that was mentioned. The hawthorn is also a relatively small tree. So different types of plants in here, as well as the 3 different seasons of fruit being ripe for the birds. Now, you may notice that in many of these examples, I'm not using species, right? So we're talking, in many cases, generalities, I say viburnums, right? Hollies. So any holly is good, right? Any native holly, any native viburnum, right? It's not just about one specific species. So just to, again, get you started and get you thinking about this. So we've done insects for reproduction. We've done fruit. Well, it may not surprise anyone if I come right back to the bird feeders, not because I'm suggesting that you do bird feeders, although again, if you have them, don't think you need to take them down. If you don't have them, do not think that you need to put them up. I put the feeders here in photos by way of saying, well, this wasn't rocket science. I mean, the creative genius who originated the bird feeding industry literally watched what the birds were doing. And perhaps they had a patch of sunflowers, in a little open field near their house. And they're like, well, most people don't have an open field with sunflowers next to their house. And most people would like to have birds in their backyard. So they started cultivating sunflowers and then, created the construct, the little feeders, and they built an industry off of something that the birds will do on their own if you simply provide the plants for them. So I'm going to focus on goldfinches for a couple of reasons. One, because it allows me to come back to a point I made earlier when I said nearly all of the songbirds eat insects during their life cycle. This is one of the rare exceptions. The American goldfinch doesn't eat insects. The American goldfinch actually feeds their young seeds. So this is one of those rare exceptions. So it's worth highlighting here and talking about seeds, feeding birds seeds through native plants. It's worth highlighting the American goldfinch. This is a coreopsis. So I'm highlighting 4 specific plants for you, native flowering plants for you. So if you like goldfinches, if you want that yellow canary, if you will, build it and they will come. Plant coreopsis. Any old coreopsis will do. This happens to be star tick seed or Coreopsis pubescens that this particular goldfinch was feeding on in the first growing season that this plant was in our yard. We bought the plant as a 4-inch pot from the Missouri Wildflowers Nursery, and most of the 4-inch pots that we plant in the spring bloom in that first season. This one did, and I took photos and videos of the goldfinch feeding on it that growing season. Speaking of videos, So here's another video, and here's another goldfinch, and this one's feeding on purple coneflower. So this is a very spent flower head that's even sort of fallen over. The goldfinch doesn't really seem to care, knows exactly what to do to get the seeds out of the coneflower head, the echinacea. This is Echinacea purpurea. In this same photo, video, so a bonus, so I actually give you 5 plants today for goldfinches. A bonus is Rudbeckia, black-eyed Susan. So this is Rudbeckia fulgida. This is the tight, round little globe seed head of Rudbeckia fulgida, one of our black-eyed Susans. So these are all very, very reliable goldfinch feeders. Another common name coneflower, this is grayhead coneflower, Ratibida pinnata, grayhead coneflower. Again, very, very reliable. Right now, I could walk around my yard, look at all of the places where the grayhead coneflower is, and I would find very few seeds left because the goldfinches and such have eaten the seeds over the winter. The last example here with the goldfinch for you, this male and breeding plumage is sunflowers. So sunflowers in general, there are a number of native commercially available sunflowers. Any of them will do as far as the goldfinches are concerned and other birds. This particular plant happens to be cup plant, Silphium perfoliatum. I say that to also then caution you. So if again, you're new to this, please do not write down cup plant and just go out and get it and put in your yard without doing a little research and doing a little homework. It's one of the biggest sunflowers as in height. It's one of the more aggressive, prolific, easily spread. Seeds are very viable. Doesn't make it a bad plant, just means you have to know what you're getting if you choose to get it. But sunflowers in general, there are certainly smaller sunflowers, shorter ones, less aggressive, and so on. It perhaps goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyways. And this is the first of several different slides and comments I'll make about gardening practices and you know, techniques, right, beyond the actual plant selection. Well, you can't be in a position to provide these seeds for the birds when they need them in the fall and winter if you don't leave the plant material up, right? So if you do cleanup, there's no seeds there, and this is not helpful. So recognizing, again, it's a human landscape, you live there too, just think about it in area spaces, right? You know, split up your landscape. If you're concerned about what the neighbors might think or your homeowners association, then, you know, choose to do this in the backyard, but do neat and tidy in the front yard, right? I mean, it's your landscape, you live there too. And you know, but recognize that if you do the neat and tidy, fall cleanup everywhere, then again, you're just shortcutting this part of the habitat. So just like the fruit, here's a slide with an array of native plants that provide seed for birds. This, again, different types of plants like we did on the other slide. Also, again, you see here, not straight, clear species. Some of them are. I mean, prairie dropseed is one species, little blue stem is one species, but asters, right, there's many different asters, the many different coreopsis, many different goldenrods. So any of them will do, and you can find the right one, the right aster for your light conditions, for your soil moisture, for you know, the size of the space that you have for it, and so on. And again, these are all, of course, going to be on YouTube with the presentation when it gets posted, since you may not have had a chance to write everything down or take your photo. So insects, fruit, seeds. Well, we touched on hummingbirds a couple different times, so we're going to come back to hummingbirds, because yeah, while you can do the feeder, many people do. I never have. I've never done a hummingbird feeder because I'm lazy and I don't want to clean it. Literally, that's exactly why. And yet we are graced with hummingbirds through most of the breeding season. I haven't yet convinced myself that they have raised young, they've had a nest in the yard, but we will see them throughout the breeding season. So they're nesting nearby and they're coming to our yard because they're finding native plants to get nectar. So we say sugar water. It is a rough approximation of flower nectar, but it's not the same, right? There's a lot of stuff that goes into that flower nectar, amino acids and other minerals and nutrients. So you know, I'm not criticizing the hummingbird feeder, but if you're going to do the native plants anyways, might as well throw in some native plants to provide the nectar for the hummingbirds as well. This is cardinal flower. For those of you in the know, this is not surprising for me to highlight hummingbirds and cardinal flower, but you know, it ain't just cardinal flowers for hummingbirds. And this, I just couldn't help but put it in because I came across it the other day in my photo file and was like, oh, that's just one of the best hummingbird photos that I've ever taken. So I have to include it. And then I have to show you this. So I like this video because it's not typical, right? This is not one of those hummingbirds flitting around in a rain garden, going to cardinal flower or royal catchfly or what have you. This is an opportunistic hummingbird who is just maybe, you know, if not tired, simply just wanted to take advantage of an appropriate perch. So they are perched while feeding. And I just couldn't resist after I had captured this video last year of finding an opportunity to include it. And there you go. All right, so just like the other slides, same thing. Not all of the native plants that are going to provide nectar to hummingbirds, but a good array, different types of plants, plants that again fit in different spaces, that grow in dry, that grow in moist, and so on. Just looking to see if I had anything to say. Yes, coral honeysuckle. So when I brag that in our small suburban lot, we get hummingbirds regularly without doing hummingbird feeders, and it's because of this plant. I have a number of other plants in the yard that they will nectar from, but this is the single most reliable place that they're going to come. The video that I showed you, that was coral honeysuckle. So the perched hummingbird nectaring, that was coral honeysuckle that it was feeding from. And this crazy native vine here in the lower Midwest can bloom continuously from April to, well, now I know November. There were a few flowers still in bloom at Thanksgiving here in St. Louis County. Now it's very profuse in the spring. It does wane after the flush in the spring, but it's continuously blooming. There's some number of flowers, you know, 3, 10, 15, 20, you know, there's an array of flowers in bloom throughout the entire growing season for that native vine. So that's my single story there. All right, so I hope you take the point. So we need native plants. So we're going to wrap up here with a few slides on garden practices, which I touched on earlier, got the thought process going, and then we'll end with resources and have some time for questions because I don't need to leave after an hour. I'm perfectly comfortable sticking around if there are questions after that. Some of you may need to leave at an hour, but I will be wrapped up before the hour mark. So gardening practices. So one, this is just a reinforcement of leaving the plant material up in the spring. This is also my testimonial to say, you know, I had that perspective of neat and tidy in the front yard. When we built this island bed in the front yard, we intended to be neat and tidy with it. And then I just couldn't help but know the value of the plant material. So I left it up through the winter. This photo was taken this past spring, actually a year ago. This photo was taken actually shortly before we did the spring haircut. Again, this is the front yard. This is still a human space. This is mowed grass around the island bed. And I just felt, you know, it's like, it's my yard. The neighbors may not like my aesthetic, but I'm doing nothing wrong. and I'm still maintaining the landscape. And look at the neat hedge in the back, right? So that's being, trimmed regularly. So the other point to be made here is that leaf blanket that I referred to earlier. We're going to talk about leaf blanket here for a couple of slides. Do not think that you need to remove the leaves from your garden beds. Do not think that the native plants need help in coming through the leaf blanket, because they don't. Right here, we have not removed the leaves from this garden bed in the plant, the silky aster. That's what this wildflower is. The silky aster is pushing up through it. I'm going to zoom in on that. This is the same space, the same plant zoomed in. And look, here comes the new stems, old stems and new stems pushing through the leaves. Let's stay in the same garden bed. We're just going to the other side, same island garden bed, a little bit clearer example of the leaves, right? All of the leaves in this garden bed from the last year or two or three. And here is a different native perennial flower called Texas Green Eyes, pushing up, the leaves coming through the leaf blanket. It doesn't really care, because of course, does anybody go around and blow out the leaves in nature? Of course they don't, right? Plants are perfectly adept at pushing through the ground layer, pushing through the leaf blanket. So last photo with the same concept, different garden bed. And here we've got two different native plants. This is several years. I can't remember when we stopped pulling leaves out of this garden bed. You see stems, you see previous stems in here, lots of leaves. This is Culver's root. Dominant here in the center is Culver's root. And then over on the right side, we've got some New England aster also pushing up. This is really, really important, because those caterpillars that we talked about, right? The critical importance of the butterfly and moth caterpillars for this food web, something better than 90% of those caterpillars spend some of their life cycle in the leaf blanket, in the ground layer. Might be eggs, might be as larvae, could be as a pupa, right? But some part of their life cycle is spent in this leaf blanket. So if you pull all those leaves out at any point, spring or fall, if you pull all those leaves out, you're removing those very same insects. You're breaking up that life cycle. You're disrupting that life cycle. Leaves are also just a natural mulch, right? I mean, they minimize the temperature extremes in the soil. They help hold soil moisture. I mean, they're free, right? They're free. You don't have to go to the store and buy your bags of mulch. So that's my story. And who doesn't like Luna moths? Luna moth is a little poster child example of one of those butterfly and moths that spend part of their life cycle in the leaf blanket. So I want to see Luna moths. All right, so that was all about food. So we got to finish the habitat by saying, yeah, well, you need water. Of course you need water. We need water. Birds need water. Wildlife needs water. So this is a quite elaborate water system. And if you've got the interest or the space, by all means, make yourself a pondless bubbler for birds and other wildlife. But don't think that you need to go to that extent. Because here we've got cedar waxwings. We have cedar waxwings coming to this poor man's, or this is my bird bath, my lazy man's bird bath. This is just a shallow plastic tray that holds water. And we even put an immersible heater in here. This is a flock of cedar waxwings come by to take a drink. So we need the water, the birds need the water, and that important doesn't have to be, again, elaborate, simple will do. And then just emphasize again, if you live anywhere that gets below freezing in the winter, do recognize the critical value of a portable immersible heater, a temperature controlled heater to keep that water available when the temperatures are cold. So I promised we would include some resources, and I promised I would wrap up before the hour. So a few slides here on resources. So if you're a reader, if you're like me at all, you want to have hard references, hard copy references, right? Books. So this is by no means all of the good resources out there. This, of course, is focused on the lower Midwest. So you've got a couple of plants, a couple of books here that are specific to the Midwest. So Native Plants of the Midwest by Alan Branhagen. And then the Native Landscaping for Wildlife and People author there is Tilka, Dave Tilka, Tylka. I'm not sure that you can see that in the graphic, even if you watch the video. So I mentioned that. But most of the books are continental in scale. They're not specific to Missouri or the lower Midwest. And there's lots of other resources out there as well. It's one of the great things about native plant landscaping, native plant gardening is the resources are just, I mean, just in the last 10 to 12 years have just really, really blossomed. So speaking of which, right, resources, so technology, 21st century resources, web-based resources. So here's a couple of really good websites. Audubon's, National Audubon's Plants for Birds program. So if you don't remember the web address, you can just Google Plants for Birds. They have a zip code searchable native plant tool. It's very cool, very helpful, very well organized, very detailed, and you put in your zip code, and so it's recommending plants suitable for your area. You obviously still have to do homework on, again, the moisture, specific sunlight, and all that sort of stuff, but at least you get the range right. The Missouri Botanical Garden has a very robust plant finder that also has the opportunity for you to click the button under advanced search to get native plants. Because of course the Missouri Botanical Garden doesn't just do native plants, so their plant finder covers the entire horticulture array. Speaking of online resources, and Brooke already mentioned, of course, the series, right, the webinars that Grow Native and the Prairie Foundation does, so by all means look up their calendar. Here's another series that I've been directly involved in helping make real. This is through the St. Louis County Library. Like any webinar, it's open, right? So you just fill out the registration form. There's no fee. These are free, just like Grow Natives. I'm highlighting here just the first two. There's actually 9 webinars in this series. You could either go to the county library's website or you can go to St. Louis Audubon's website and you can get the full flyer with detailed descriptions of all 9 webinars starting next Wednesday. My last couple slides for resources, here's some more websites and organizations. So Grow Native, no surprise, I come back to them. So the webinars you know about, they've got speaking of plant database, they redid their website about a year ago and totally updated their plant database, which is very robust. It wasn't bad before, it just got a lot better. They also have a resource guide that allows you to find professionals. The Conservation Department I mentioned earlier, lots of really good online information and pamphlets that you can order. Shaw Nature Reserve, if you live nearby, is an insanely cool place to visit to see native plants in person in the garden. They've also got they have a native landscaping manual that you can find through shawnature.org, and you can view it for free. You can download it for free, or you can get a paper copy for just $5. And then depending upon where you are, you may have a Wild Ones chapter nearby. A very, very cool group of native plant crazy people, wonderful native plant crazy people. They're garden clubs for native plant enthusiasts. So all of the benefits of a garden club and all about native plants. And then my last resource, which has a couple of slides to follow, is this Bring Conservation Home program that I mentioned earlier. If you are in the St. Louis region, you might check into it because it is a very in-depth consultation service. So pre-COVID, we would visit every landscape in person. We would spend a couple hours with each landowner, talk about the goals and interests, look at the site conditions of the space, and then provide detailed written recommendations to each landowner based on that consultation. So COVID didn't shut the program down. COVID just made us creative, and we used Zoom to do consultations. We would visit the landscape. We would take photos and notes in advance of the video consult. And then we would spend 2 hours with the landowner on Zoom, viewing those photos and talking about their landscape and their goals. And they'd still get the very detailed written recommendations. So it's St. Louis Region program. If you're in the area, visit the St. Louis Audubon website. At the moment, the request form is still closed for the winter season, but I anticipate it will be opening up within a matter of days. and at worst, a week or two, and the request form will be open if you wanted to reach out. So wonderful smiling faces. These are folks in the Bring Conservation Home program, but these are also folks that are holding yard signs. And that's another point I wanted to make. These happen to be BCH certification signs, but yard signs are a really valuable tool if you're doing native plant gardening, just to help people understand what you're doing. So I have two closing slides, and this one, I am just going to stop talking because I want all of you to read these two quotes. So I have historically shared a comment or two of my own, which was fine, but with all the feedback we've gotten from the program over the years, I realized it's even better to just share thoughts from some of our homeowners, from the landowners in the BCH program. And they can't, I can't say it any better than they do, of how powerful, how inspirational, how really cool it is to get into native plant landscaping. So this is my closing slide. This is just a quick summary. Again, we need the native plants in order to do this right. Like I said, don't limit yourself just because of homeowners association or whatever. You can do neat and tidy with native plants if you choose to do it that way. You still live there. Again, the signs can be very helpful just to, again, help people understand what's going on. So that's my story. That's the pitch. That I hope is helpful. I hope you learned some things. I hope you saw some resources. And again, I don't need to go anywhere, so I will stick around and I will let Brooke facilitate some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. We do have a number of questions and some looks like some conversations happening in the chat as well. So I will get started kind of hitting these first ones that haven't already been addressed. Someone asks here, what do you do about feral cats? Since, attracting birds is great, what do you do about feral cats in the area? Someone said, she said, if I plant natives with thorns and I use brush piles, do you think that might have some birds nesting and not be disturbed by the cats?
Yeah, so very good question, and unfortunately a very common problem because while feral cats are sort of officially kind of like, cats that live outdoors that probably don't have an owner, but there are a lot of well-meaning folks that have an indoor cat that they allow outside. And so the same concerns apply. I have actually a slightly longer presentation that touches on some of these other subjects. So yeah, it's very, very wise to be aware of that concern. If you have cats in your area, and if you go into this, aggressive thought process of building habitat for birds and other wildlife, you don't want to inadvertently be creating, sort of a problem, right? Sort of feeding ground for the birds. So I would steer away from brush piles, first of all. They can be a useful tool, but in most settings, they just end up supporting rodents. And there's very few birds that would nest in a brush pile. Most bird nesting happens in shrubs and small trees. Most songbird nesting is in shrubs and small trees. Honestly, the single best advice I would have where you have cats around is don't do bird houses at all. If you do bird feeders and if you do the bird bath, the water feature, ensure you've got a good 6 foot radius around those things, around the bird feeders and around the bird bath. The idea being that you don't want a whole bunch of dense plant material near that bird bath or those bird feeders where the cats could sneak up on the birds while they're distracted with the feeder or the bird bath. I hope that helps a little bit.
Yes, thank you. Another question, any suggestions on deterring European starlings from visiting feeders and habitats?
Very appropriate question, given I'm here at a place in our house where I'm looking through the patio door, and the starlings are assaulting the fresh suet, the suet that I put out this morning for the woodpeckers, and the starlings are assaulting it. The very best thing about starlings is they are opportunistic, seasonal. I'm not promising or telling you that you will not see them in any old time of the year. You might, but typically it's late winter, early spring. They're not yet in breeding mode. They're still in their congregated numbers. The hormones haven't started yet, and they're just looking for food any old where, and then they disappear. So patience is the thing with starlings. Don't give up on everything. They will move along. And when it comes to native plants, I have never seen a starling visit any one of my native plants. And I don't have any bad feelings about that at all, because of course starlings are an imported European bird.
Okay, thank you for that. Another person asked, will adult birds feed the dried, dead worms to their young if those are put out?
You know, that's a very good question, because we know that the mealworms, the dried mealworms, are very popular with the right bird in the right when you actually have those birds present and they find your dried mealworms. I honestly just don't know the answer to that question. My logic tells me that they probably don't feed the dried mealworms to their young. Most animals, and this is not just birds, most animals feed on live prey. And hence it's an exception when we have like vultures and certain critters that feed on dead animals. So if it's not moving, I think the adults are just being opportunistic and taking advantage of those dried mealworms. But I'm a little doubtful that they would feed them to their babies.
Thank you. Someone asked, is there a list with berry nutritional content as with like carb, protein, lipids, etc., when it comes to feeding those to birds?
Yeah, and as far as like the native plants go, I've honestly not seen that. It might not be surprising when I say that nutritional analysis can be expensive, and so our food, right, human food, we know all about the nutrition analysis of the food we buy in a grocery store, but there's just it costs money for scientists to go around and to survey the thousands of plant species across North America for nutritional analysis. So I'm sure you could find data out there for some species, but I've never seen it for large arrays of native plants. And my bet is that it's probably not out there. You'll find graduate papers or different research for certain types of plants where they've looked into nutritional analysis, but probably not available for the entire array of native plants.
Thank you. How does one balance caterpillars eating vegetables like their leafy greens? How do they balance that with providing a monarch pollinator station, bird food, etc.?
Yeah, very good question, and an important one, because growing food is valuable in a whole lot of ways, right? Growing human food, that is. What I can tell you on certainly on the herb side, on growing dill, parsley, fennel. So those are three very common backyard herbs that people would grow. And almost anybody in the range of the black swallowtail caterpillars will tell you that they have discovered black swallowtail caterpillars because they started growing those herbs and they found the caterpillars munching on their herbs. Most people that grow herbs that I've discussed this with, they're like, yeah. And then I learned what it was. It's a beautiful, wonderful butterfly. Yeah, I planted more herbs next year, the following year. It's like, those are yours. These are mine. And again, it's somewhat tongue in cheek, but it's also somewhat serious. And so So the idea being you want to be friendly to wildlife, you want the inspirational value of all these critters, but you don't want to lose all of your investment and you don't want to lose your food. So you could also consider cordoning off, right? Separating in certain ways physically. If your space is small, if your space is small and you don't have the opportunity to add more of that particular type of plant that they're munching on, tomato hornworms, right, come to mind. Tomato hornworms, by the way, want to become hummingbird moths, sphinx moths, which are some of the coolest moths out there. But all that said, this is the most important point. All that said, you live there too. And if you can't add more food and you're like, well, but I want this stuff, well, you might have to kill some of the caterpillars, I mean, that's just the way it may be in your space for now.
Thank you. There's a few questions. I think it was when, coral honeysuckle got put up. There were some questions about where folks can buy it. And that's what I just want to remind everybody about the resource. Mitch mentioned the Grow Native Resource Guide lists out different native plant sellers all across the state of Missouri and the lower Midwest. So I'll send that out tomorrow to folks that are wanting to look up how to find that plant. And there were some other questions about it. Does that coral honeysuckle grow aggressively? Do you have experience with that one?
Yeah, so quick follow-up on the where to get plants. So the resource guide that we both mentioned, again, perfect for anyone in the lower Midwest. Should you live outside of that area, the Plants for Birds website that I mentioned briefly from National Audubon also includes plant resources, so including nurseries. So if you have a local Audubon chapter that is into native plants, they should have populated for your zip code if you've got native plant nurseries nearby. So that's a helpful tool there as well. The specific behavior of that particular plant, I wouldn't call it a benign vine. It is a woody vine, so sort of by definition, it's more aggressive than a herbaceous vine because it is starting over from where it left off each year, right? So there's more plant material. But I have not found it unwieldy. We've done some aggressive pruning on it here just over the winter, which is one of the other cool things I would say about it. Not only do I not consider it highly aggressive, it seems manageable, but also it's very hearty. So pruning back, it doesn't care, it's very, very easy to manage.
Thank you for that. There are a number of questions whenever you're bringing up leaving the leaves and not cleaning up so early in the spring. There were some questions about timelines for folks that would, I know you mentioned showing some leaves that may have been there for years, but for folks that do want to tidy up, do you have some suggestions on a timeline with that? Or especially, I see some comments about oak leaves coming down late and pile up deeply, how to handle that, and some questions about mulching up the leaves. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So take the last one first. So it's analogous to some other comments I've made. If you're raking leaves, from the grass, and you're like, hey, well, I'd rather not yard waste them and send them away, and yet my garden beds are small enough that I can't just put all these in the garden beds, right? They'd overwhelm it, right? They'd be like 3 feet deep. And so, like, well, I want to run over them with a lawnmower or, run them through a shredder or something. Well, again, you might lose the eggs or pupa or something that might be a part of those leaves or attached to those leaves. And yet you're going to be doing these practices, these friendly practices in the garden beds and other spaces, right? So again, just constantly reminding ourselves of what the goal may be, but also trying to manage and recognize, well, humans live here too. So as far as timing and, if you do want to be a little neat and organized, you want to pull some things out or whatever. So the most often referenced figure is a temperature figure, and it's average daily temperature of 50 degrees. So it's when your area reaches for several days in a row, right? So it's not just the first time, but it's for a consistent period, average daily temperature of 50 degrees or more. Many of these critters have emerged or started to resume or moved on, but it's not all, right? This is not a black and white. They all read the book and they all just march to one tune. So that's again not to say that you can't do the neat and tidy, but just recognize that the later you wait, the more comfortable you get with simply leaving the leaves entirely, the more comprehensive, the more thorough, the more across the board you'll be supporting the wildlife. And just starting to take those steps is the important part.
Great, thank you so much. Here's a question. During these sub-zero temps we recently had, I found 6 dead birds, house finches, and sparrows. I kept my feeders full and at least 3 heated bird baths going. What else might have helped these birds?
So the one else that may or may not be present in your yard would have been shelter, and that doesn't necessarily mean a birdhouse, right? Because there are plenty of birds that go the entire winter and do not go into a cavity, a natural or artificial cavity. But birdhouses, should you have them, can be very useful winter roosts for small songbirds. But lacking that, or being a bird that doesn't utilize that type of thing, it's that plant material. It's dense shrubs. I was in the yard this morning and just walked. It was sort of surveying. That's what we do in the spring. We start to see what's happening in the yard, and walked over toward the blackberry patch, and a rabbit ran out. Well, I didn't know the rabbit was in there, but the rabbit was sheltering in there. And the rabbit, I'm sure, finds the blackberry patch, even without leaves on them in the middle of winter, a good place to be. The other thing, and perhaps as important as anything when it comes to finding animals that succumb after extreme weather, is a simple reminder that everything dies at some point, in extreme weather events very, very readily take the lives of birds that are old, that are infirm, that have, health issues. So seeing dead animals after extreme weather shouldn't necessarily mean anything in particular. It might just mean that those birds just were, they didn't make it. They were less equipped.
Thank you. That was good. Someone said they get the tent caterpillar nests in their wild cherry trees in their yard. Should they leave those for the birds? Will the birds eat those caterpillars, or is it better to remove those to protect the trees from damage?
Yeah, so it's like context, right? So that's a word you could apply to a lot of the things I've said so far with the Q&A in particular. If you've got one cherry tree, it's a prized cherry tree, it's the only cherry tree, you probably want to be aggressive in managing those tent caterpillars. And there are native tent caterpillars as well as non-native. So I do want to account for the fact that they may be, part of the ecosystem. The wild challenge is that tent is their defense mechanism. They live colonially and would be easy food if not for their tent, right? So that's their way of trying to prevent the birds from getting to them. So a mentor of mine and the author of that book, Dave Tilka, that I mentioned earlier, he likes to offer and point out a tip he's used over the years is he'll just get a stick and like on a daily basis, he'll just walk over and he'll just open up that tent, right? Just sort of pull it apart, just sort of give access for birds to come by before the caterpillars fill it back in. So back to the first point, if it's a single prize tree, you might choose to literally just cut that limb off and dispose of the caterpillars to conserve the tree, to preserve the tree.
Thank you for that. I'm glad to know that ripping open the nest is okay. When I used to work with kids at a summer camp, we would do that when kids wanted to play with insects. We're like, well, here, there's some easy access ones in a tree right here. All right, and there's a few questions where folks are asking about nativars and cultivars whenever it comes to the benefits for birds. Does St. Louis Audubon, or in your experience, do you all have a stance on the nativar and cultivar plants?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And this is another one of those things that's been really, really cool to see the science starting to catch up over the last 3, 5, 6 years. It's something, again, nativar, cultivars, cultivated varieties of plants have been around for a long time through horticulture. And just the limited number of researchers and scientists out there, it just wasn't being studied. It just didn't get the attention of people. And so now we're actually having papers written on the subject. And the logic that many smart people were using, like Doug Tallamy and Dave Tilka, the logic that was being used for years is being supported by the research now. And that's to simply say that if the structure of the plant, the structure of the flower hasn't changed, the flower in particular, right? It's a perennial flower. If it still looks like a coneflower, if it still looks like a serviceberry, if the structure of the flower hasn't changed, and say maybe it's just a short plant, right? There's a lot of cultivars out there that are selected for size. And your New England aster is just a short variety, but it looks like a New England aster in all other manners, it's probably fine. So if the cultivar, the nativar is just a small shrub, a small variety, you're probably fine. If the color of the flower has changed, if the structure of the flower has changed, if the color of the leaves have changed, be concerned. Because by definition, the chemistry of the leaf has changed if the color is different than the native wild type. And again, the whole thing about caterpillars eating leaves, well, they may not be able to eat the leaves of the colored variety. So cultivars and nativars are really valuable because they're so readily propagated through the nursery trade. And we have such demand for native plants these days, and the interest in supporting bees and monarch butterflies and birds and so on. So we really want to accept as much usage of cultivars and nativars as we can, so long as we're selecting the ones that are still functional for the wildlife.
Great, thank you for that explanation. Someone else asked, how do you balance the desire to have a butterfly sanctuary with the desire to help and create a sanctuary for the birds? You kind of mentioned that, having plants out there for the butterflies, it's so the birds can eat those caterpillars. Do you have any guidance on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a bird gardening talk, right? If this was a butterfly gardening talk, it'd be slightly different. But only to a point, because I have acknowledged on a few different occasions throughout the talk of pretty butterflies and cool moths, and if the butterfly person was talking right now, they would be talking about the wonderful birds that will come and eat some of these butterfly caterpillars, and those birds are cool too. So it's about abundance, and one of the things I teach a couple of classes at the local community college, so we have several hours to go through some of this stuff. And I have a slide that talks about diversity versus quantity. And I spend like 5 or 6 minutes just talking about how diversity is important, right? So having many different types of native plants in your landscape, that is important. That is what nature does. Not a monoculture, right? Not like a single cornfield like what we do with industrial agriculture. So diversity is really important, and yet quantity is important too. And I bring this up now with this question because the more quantity you can have of milkweed, of aster, of oak trees, of cherry trees, the more quantity you can have of those things, the more you would be comfortable going, yeah, I know I'm feeding birds, but there's still going to be some caterpillars left that will mature and be adults and lay eggs and continue into future generations. So the quantity is really important, and that's really the answer to the question. Is it's don't try to make the decisions like, go out and, eeny meeny and you stay and, I protect you and I don't protect you, and just feel like, okay, well, let me build the landscape over time and add quantity more and more over time and feel more and more comfortable that you're being able to feed all the different pieces of the food web.
That is great. Thank you. Here's a good question. I have a large picture window that frequently has bird strikes. As I plant things to attract more birds, is there something I can do to protect them? And this person, they say, due to HOA rules, they can't hang things from the window, but they're asking about if there are blinds in the window. But we do have blinds in the window, but the reflection on the outside overpowers the inside blinds.
Yeah. This is another one of those hazards, right? So we started with cats, and window strikes is another one where, again, a longer talk, I would have brought this up. So this is also an area that's really exciting because the science has just really blossomed in the last 10 to 20 years, and more importantly, the solutions are not only readily available but inexpensive. So one of the single best places you could go to see a whole bunch of helpful tips is the American Bird Conservancy. So their website is abcbirds.org, American Bird Conservancy. And you can look up threats, and they talk about windows, and they've got an array of simple solutions, simple residential solutions for window strikes. As you have observed, as the questioner has observed, it has to be an outside solution, because anything done on the inside, that window, if highly reflective, if having habitat or open sky or whatever that is being reflected, the birds will still react to that regardless of what goes on inside. So there are appliques, there are little strips, there are really, again, inexpensive and highly effective things you can do on the outside that might hopefully be acceptable with the HOA.
Great, thank you for that. Someone asked, do any birds eat monarch caterpillars?
Well, yeah, and it's most typically it's the young caterpillars. So as many folks learn, it's just the way it's taught, it's a little bit disingenuous, or should say it's not thorough enough. It's well, monarch caterpillars are toxic, so birds don't eat them. Well, the thing is, though, you don't come out of the egg in the nest knowing that you don't eat monarch caterpillars. Instead, you're either taught that by a parent or you learn that by trying a monarch caterpillar. So in other words, the monarch caterpillars demonstrate their toxicity by being eaten or by somebody trying to eat them. But back to the very specific question, the toxicity builds up in the life stages, right? So caterpillars, we learned when we were in grade school, you may have forgotten, but they go through these life stages, these instars, right? So they molt their skin and they expand their physical body as they eat over several life stages. And so that those toxins build up from life stage to life stage. So when they're the first couple of life stages, first couple of instars, they just don't have a whole lot of toxins in them. So they are actually quite readily consumed.
Thank you. Here's a interesting question. Someone had a robin build a nest in their hanging basket on the porch. They didn't water the basket because they didn't want to drown bird, but then the fern died and probably didn't help the bird with shade and cover. How would you recommend tending to plants that might be being used as a bird for a nest?
Yeah, good question. Staying away from it is what I would do, for some of the reasons that the questioner sort of implies. You know, if the adult is sitting on eggs and you come in to water the plants because you don't want the plants to die, well, you might hope that the adult doesn't really have that big of a problem. Adult, of course, would get wet in rain, but then again, the adult might fly away, right, as you come to the nest to do the watering. And of course, if there are babies on the nest, you certainly wouldn't want to do the watering. And it's worth pointing out that they might have put the nest in the hanging basket in the planter in the first place because that planter might not be exposed to rain, right? It might be underneath an eave or underneath a soffit. I would lean on the bird end of that and do exactly what you did and go, well, I want to do right by the birds, and I might lose the plant, and we'll just see what happens.
Thank you. Here, someone asked, I think I saw a small garden fence around one of Mitch's beds. Just curious if that was an enclosure of some sort or exclosure of some sort.
So you did the photos where I was talking about the haircut and the silky aster and the plants pushing through the leaves. That island bed that we put in. We fortunately don't have a deer problem in our particular yard, but we do occasionally get rabbits. In the spring that we planted that bed, there was a rabbit in the yard that very quickly showed itself and was like the new young plants. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to lose my investment. You can go eat the older plants. You can go eat in other parts of the yard. You can eat the clover and the violets in the yard. So that's what the fence was for the rabbits.
Great, thank you. Here's a question. Can you please comment on the use of aerial spray of BTK for a severe gypsy moth outbreak? We have many oaks and pines and a habitat of rare Lepidoptera species. Is that anything you've dealt with?
That's not anything I can respond to.
Okay.
I mean, it's like I've heard of BTK. That's it. And of course, I know what gypsy moths are, and I know full well that gypsy moths are a real concern in wide swaths of the country. But I can't really respond to it otherwise. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Someone had asked us, I think in response when we were talking about the tomatoes, if they pick those hornworms off the tomatoes, can they serve them to birds on a platform feeder or some other way? Would they eat a pre-squashed caterpillar?
You might try it. That's I actually like the thinking. I like the thinking a lot of, hey, I live here and I want to keep my vegetables, but I want to support the wildlife in any way I can. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with giving it a try, right?
Yes, and for who submitted that comment, please let us know how that goes.
Exactly. Report back, please.
Yeah, there's quite a few questions about people wanting to know where to start with a native garden. And tomorrow, whenever I send out a link with the recording and many of these resources mentioned in the presentation and this Q&A session, I'll link some information from the Grow Native website about getting started and the best ways. But Mitch, if someone could only plant one native plant for birds, what is the one you would recommend?
Yeah, so I mean, getting started is of course, that's like a big deal for anybody, right? Just embarking upon this journey. I would say two things. One, I would say you can't go wrong, right? I mean, it's respect your goals and the size of your landscape and its conditions, and start with anything. because hopefully one of the things that came through in our discussion today is that any native plant is going to help support birds and other wildlife, right? So any plant will do. Now, to Brooke's specific challenge is I would start, if you know, want to do just one, you know, I would start with a shrub or a small tree. That's what I would start with. Because you're going to support pollinators, because that shrub or small tree is going to be a flowering plant. It'll be native, so it's going to support caterpillars, will eat the leaves. And depending upon your conditions, you may have the good fortune of selecting a fruit-bearing shrub or small tree. So now you're also supporting that part of the life cycle. And I mentioned this briefly, but nesting, most of our songbirds nest in shrubs and small trees. So you also would have the opportunity over time, probably not right away, but over time, that same plant might also support nesting.
Great. That was a good little description of it, and probably a good place to go ahead and wrap up for the evening. I will say, after we mentioned the serving those hornworms, some people mentioned that, oh yes, I grab them and cut them up and stick them on platform feeders, and they get eaten right away. Same with some other pests. So that is good to know. But I think we'll go ahead and wrap up here. Some of the questions that are coming in might be repeat or things that we'll answer with these resources that are getting sent out tomorrow, just about more general, where to find plants, what a good top 10 list would be, things like that. So Mitch, thank you so much. This was a fantastic presentation. I know I learned a lot, and you have lots of praise coming in the chat and in the Q&A. So do you have any parting words of wisdom for us?
I don't think I have any more parting words of wisdom than the comments that were made just a minute ago. Mm-hmm. Again, just getting started, right? Pick a spot, pick a plant, pick an area, because the inspiration that you're going to get from native plants, from habitat gardening, from gardening for birds, the inspiration is just going to fuel you, just going to feed you and inspire you to do more. And then again, just come back to the couple of quotes from the homeowners here. Again, they say it better than I can. But thank you again. Thank you, Brooke. Thank you to Carol and the whole team, and the invitation to be here today. It was a lot of fun, and I really enjoy spreading the word.
Yes, thank you for being here. It was fantastic. So have a good evening, and everyone else have a good evening as well.